Scotland is an ancient and wild place. It's there that the unstoppable expansion of the mighty Roman Empire was halted firmly in its tracks. Legionnaire veterans, hardened by years of bloody conflict on the savage frontiers of the Imperium, turned back once they reached the land they called Caledonia. It's always been somewhat of a mystery to historians as why Rome ceased its conquest just short of complete victory. Why its generals chose to build a 73-mile-long wall that stretched coast to coast across northern Britain. Some scholars note the lack of natural resources, explaining that the empire had nothing to gain from subduing the Scots. But thick ancient forests would have yielded millions of tons of lumber to fuel the empire's war machine, not to mention the abundant red iron ore buried in Scotland's vast rolling hills. Regardless, the answer to the age-old question actually does reside in the land's seemingly infinite, impenetrable forests. For there is something that exists in the dark, damp woodlands of old Caledonia. Something that was once worshipped before it slipped into rumor and legend. Something that was here long before humanity and will be here long after we're gone. I grew up in the Boston neighborhood of Charleston, the son of a moderately wealthy set of parents who were still very much in love. My dad would take me to Red Sox games followed by big, greasy pizza slices in the North End. Mom ran a small Italian pastry place, sometimes bringing home a batch of all the cannoli and Napoleons that weren't sold that day. It was a happy childhood, but one that was about to be cut short, one bitterly cold Christmas Eve, shortly before I graduated high school. It was one of those frigid New England winters. Thick fog hung in the air, water pipes froze and burst, forming patches of black ice that slowed traffic to a crawl. My father was headed home from a local bar after a few festive beers with his work buddies. But just a block from his house, he slipped on a patch of sleet and hit his head on the sidewalk. The doctor said he suffered a brain hemorrhage, and that we'd be lucky if we would talk to him if he ever woke up from his coma. A month later, on the 30th of January, my mother made the decision to have his life support turned off. I don't think she has ever forgiven herself. It was then that our relationship began to deteriorate. She grew depressed and spiteful. She started to self-medicate with vodka and Valium. She never, ever said it, but I knew I reminded her of my father. I had his eyes, she used to say, his nose. All that anger, frustration she held for him, choosing to walk home instead of getting a cab like she told him to. It was all taken out of me. It broke my heart, but in a twisted way, I understood. So by the time college applications came around, the University of Edinburgh in Scotland offered me a place to study contemporary history as a part of an exchange program. I jumped at the chance. I had to get away. It was definitely what I needed. It was what she needed too. As an American abroad, I was often an object of curiosity, viewed as practically exotic by many of the local populace. I made friends with a fellow exchange student who was also from the US, forming a kind of not-so-homesick Americans club who saw themselves as a duo of adventurers from the old colonies, exploring the lands of their ancestors. Unlike myself, my compatriot was a country boy, much more accustomed to hauling their hunting rifle through the swamps of Florida than hauling back book bags along grimy city streets. So it only took a few months before my southern friend was conspiring to take me camping, determined to share the peace and bounty of nature he missed so very much. So together with one of our English friends, Morgan, we planned a trip to the largest forest of the United Kingdom. Gallows Forest, 300 square miles of lakes, hills, and woodland, with only a handful of trails dividing it up. Even now, I find it hard to bring myself to write its name.
It'll do us a world of good to take a break from the city,
said Morgan, stepping off into the railway platform of a small Scottish town.
Get some fresh air in the lungs. Get back in touch with Mother Nature.
I hear you, man, Noah responded, proudly sporting his Miami Dolphins hoodie. Even somewhere as awesome as Edinburgh, after a while, I just start to feel suffocated, you know? I just think it's going to be kind of weird going camping without a rifle. I feel like naked or something. Your arms are going to thank you later, I remarked with a laugh. I went hunting with my uncle once. That Remington got real heavy after carrying it for a few hours. Besides, there ain't no bears or gators here. It was a chill October morning as we made the short hike out of town, paying no mind to the locals who eyed us suspiciously from grubby window panes. Not even a half hour had passed, but already I was regretting having packed so much in my rucksack. The straps dug into my shoulder so hard it felt like they were cutting off circulation. I had to rest my thumbs under them, just to keep the ache at bay. Naturally, it was a great relief when a life stack wagon came trundling around a bend. Noah instinctually threw up a thumb, drawing the attention of the driver who stopped his vehicle, smiling as he gestured for us to hop in the back. It smelled terrible. One of the sheep even tried eating my jacket, but I have never been so completely relieved to be off of my feet. After almost an hour on the road, in the back of the cramped, stinking wagon, the vehicle reached its destination and pulled up near a set of farm buildings. We thanked the farmer and he wished us a safe journey, in his nearly incomprehensible accent, before we began to make our way along the road again. The autumn sun was in the afternoon, and it was declining as we continued to trudge along the narrow country lanes. The strain of lugging my heavy pack had beads of sweat forming on my brow, a dull ache now present in my shoulders and feet. It had been hours since we had seen any cars or people, and it was beginning to show in our environment. Foliage at the sides of the road grew progressively untamed, dry stone walls crumbling as twisting vines began to reclaim what was once mankind's. We were getting pretty tired at this point. We'd been walking all morning and it didn't seem like we were getting any closer to the actual forest. The narrow country lanes flanked on each side by wildly overgrown hedgerows. They were beginning to all look identical. As frustration grew, Morgan and Noah began to argue over which route we should have taken. It was so heated that they didn't even hear my remark about someone watching us from further down the lane. I had to raise my voice to even get their attention. They stopped, shocked into silence by the sudden appearance of a solitary figure I was pointing toward. The man stood at the side of the road, wearing tattered clothes and a long, white wisp of a beard. He stood perfectly still, staring at us, with wide, curious eyes.
Hello? Hi there. We're just wondering if you know...
Morgan cut himself off as the man began shaking his head nervously in a small, rapid motion.
Look, all we need are some directions.
No, the man hissed. His voice was hoarse, almost weak sounding, as if it had been a very, very long time since he had last spoken. We tried to get any kind of information out of him, remaining perfectly polite the entire time, but he still just shook his head, struggling to make eye contact with us. He didn't say another word, not even as we said our goodbyes and passed him in the road. The man just stood there, watching us march toward our fate. After a day's worth of walking, we had finally reached the end of the road. The tarmac was cracked and weathered. Grass sprouted through the tiny fissures in the surface. It was here that the road literally and physically ended, swallowed up by nature as the vast, sprawling forest opened up ahead of us. It struck me as deeply unnerving seeing a road so inexplicably abandoned. It was primeval. Millions of huge, dense pines that spread out before us like an ocean of dark green. I had never seen anything quite like it in my life. By this point, the sun was beginning to sink towards the horizon, transforming the sky's deep blue into magnificent shades of pink and orange. Despite being hungry, thirsty, and disgustingly sweat-soaked from our excursions, we decided to push on. We had to. After all, darkness was drawing near. Moving through the forest itself was hard work. Pine needles dug into exposed flesh while small biting insects feasted on us, causing huge, itchy welts. Walking behind someone meant that thin, spiky branches would whip back into your face. It was agonizing. Even the country boys were beginning to complain. So upon reaching the first real clearing in the thick pines, we began to set up camp. At this point, I almost want to tell you that we heard scary noises coming through the trees as pale moonlight cast ominous shadows around us. But we didn't. Aside from the ghostly calls of a few owls, the first night was actually pretty serene. The guys were right. This outdoor stuff really did bring some sort of peace, if only for a short while. Looking back, I almost wish something had happened on that first night. Maybe then we would have just turned back while we still had the chance. Started the next morning. The brisk, blue October sky had become a ceiling of gray clouds. We packed to our camp, opting for a meager breakfast of trail mix before pushing deeper into the woods. We were worn out, so hacking our way through the pines was even more exhausting than yesterday. Sometimes we would find a little clearing, somewhere the trees opened up a little and we would get a good look at just where we were. It was an ancient, ethereal forest, beds of moss spreading out before us. Noah remarked that we must be 15 to 20 miles away from the nearest piece of farmland, even further from the nearest village. This place was truly untouched, or so we thought. As we traipsed through the almost impenetrable forest, I began to notice bright, artificial colors. Pushing through the pines into another small glade, we came across an empty campsite. 2 vacant tents with a small burnt-out fire between them. There was nothing obvious or unusual about the setup, but upon further inspection, we noticed a few small details that made us very anxious indeed. Mess tins filled with rotten food were sat near the charred logs and ash that made up the extinguished campfire. Half-full plastic bottles of murky, stagnant water lay nearby.
Oh, wow. Someone had a rough time walking out of here,
Morgan said with a chuckle, reaching into one of the open tents and producing a pair of ladies' hiking boots. They were small, purple, with pink straps of plastic around the lacing. Why would someone leave their boots? I asked, nervously scanning the area. The forest was completely silent aside from the cawing of a distant raven. I don't know, blisters maybe? Noah replied nonchalantly. I've seen weirder stuff in the woods, but he fell silent. Something was bothering him. This camp looks like it was abandoned in a hurry. Like they just took off for some reason.
Not everyone can stomach camping in Scotland,
Morgan remarked smugly.
Maybe they just didn't have the minerals. Anyway, there's nothing of use to us here. Well, aside from that tinned food. We could always just come back for it.
True. Let's keep moving. Noah nodded, making his way back into the pines as Morgan and I began to follow. But upon our departure, I noticed something about some of the trees surrounding the camp. On many of them, the bark was torn away on one side, a pattern of deep gashes marking the raw timber beneath. Trails of sticky sap bled down the trunks, appearing as sticky, shimmering trails of dull in the morning light. It reminded me of what black bears do to trees during the mating season back in New England. Only there are no bears in the UK, and these markings were much, much bigger. After another hour or so of walking, the trees thinned out until we found ourselves at the top of a steep hill with a commanding view of the entire area. It was impossibly vast. The area of wilderness that stretched out before us was unfettered with artificial construction. In the distance, we could make out the dull blue of a large, freshwater lake, our designated water source for the camping trip. That's it, right? I remember asking. That's Loch Aber. Noah took a pair of binoculars, fiddling with the zoom, before bringing them to his eyes. Morgan and I took off our packs, lowering our aching bodies to the dirt to recoup some energy. Noah observed the terrain for a few moments, muttering complaints to himself. Suddenly, he fell silent. His mouth dropped open. He only took the binoculars away from his eyes when his hands began to shake. What the F is that, dude? Noah was pale, thrusting the binoculars in Morgan's direction, with a distinct hint of panic in his voice. Look over there. Do you see that? Morgan took the binoculars, directing the telescopic lenses to where our friend was pointing.
I see a lot of trees, mate. Very little else.
Ah, Noah growled, grabbing the binoculars trying to relocate what he had seen. I did not just imagine that shit. I swear to God, dude, it was... He struggled to find the words, falling into the dirt with his head in his hands.
What? What did you see, Noah? Bloody hell, mate. Talk to me.
Morgan was trying to laugh off the tension, but it was obviously forced. Noah never acted like this. He knew something was wrong. As I listened to Noah and Morgan begin to argue again, a flash of movement in my peripheral vision caught my eye. I turned to look, but there was nothing, only the silence and stillness of the woods. I told myself it was a rabbit or a squirrel, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was watching us through the trees. Something larger, something older. At first, Noah refused to continue the journey, insisting that he had seen something that was not a trick of the light. We pressed him for more information, but he only seemed to grow increasingly frightened as he tried to describe the thing he saw, almost as if he couldn't comprehend it. It took a while, but we did manage to calm him down, convincing him to rationalize whatever he had seen and just to move on. 19 hours of walking and you just want me to turn back now? Man the F up. This seemed to do the trick. We had only just arrived in Galloway. To turn back now would be a monumental waste of time and effort. Reluctantly, he agreed to move on. We were beyond drained by that point. Physical and emotional exhaustion had set in so heavily that I had to force one foot in front of the other in order to keep going. One more step, I kept telling myself. One more step and we can rest for a while. My hands and neck throbbed from the incessant itching of insect bites. My neck, back, and shoulders were aching from hauling my stone-heavy pack through acres and acres of wild woodland. All of a sudden, I felt my foot snag on something hidden by the blanket of greenery underfoot. I remember hitting the dirt hard and the impact knocking the wind out of me for a moment as I struggled again to get my footing. "Jesus, you okay back there?" one of the guys asked. I just gave them a nod, still fighting to catch my breath. Morgan walked over to the patch of forest I had tripped over, his eyes narrowing as he spied something hidden amongst the moss. He touched down, took a grip of something, straining as he attempted to wrench it from the earth. "What the hell are you doing, Morgan?" Noah sighed, shaking his head as we continued to walk, albeit at a much slower pace. With a grunt, Morgan finally freed the thing from its shallow grave, wiping away caked dirt from a section of it. It was worn, jaggedly broken, but it was unmistakable. It was steel. Clearing away more soil revealed what appeared to be a partially decomposed ivory hilt.
This is a bloody Roman sword. It's a gladius. Look at it.
He was transfixed. The thought of an untapped source of Roman artifacts was evidently making his head spin.
We gotta keep going. There could be more of this stuff. I mean, we could be rich. I mean, seriously, fucking rich.
Guys, the fear in Noah's voice made my blood run cold. You better come see this. I had no idea back then that there are things the human mind is almost incapable of comprehending. Many of our natural reactions to stimuli have been trained and redefined by our ancestors, almost as if we're programmed to react in a certain predefined way. However, when eyes present the brain with images that it has no pre-programmed reaction to, the system stutters. The body is not told how to react. We wandered towards the clearing, pushing through the trees that concealed Noah from us. There we found him, frozen to the spot, quaking before something I still see in my darkest of nightmares. There were huge pine trees, twisted and deformed, their roots and limbs winding together into a kind of arcing cradle. Beneath them, a large, shallow pit had been cut away from the earth. Every inch was filled with bones. Entire rib cages jutted out from the soil like animal traps. Long femurs, yellowed and broken with age, were arranged into intricate patterns into the earth beneath us. Centipedes and lice crawled out of the open eye sockets of cracked skulls, their jaws hanging open in a silent scream of death. There must have been hundreds, if not thousands of human remains, half buried in the earth before us. As my eyes returned to the twisted mass of trees and branches and roots above us, I noticed a dull glittering among the network of woven tree limbs. Withered steel helmets, still with a few slivers of red plumage, brass jewelry, had been intricately stitched into the patchwork of dry branches. Roman coins, more than 1,000 years old, were pressed so hard into the dying timber that the trees were growing up and around them, half consuming the small pieces of bronze. They were stunned, completely and utterly awestruck by the horror of what stood in front of us. Apart from the rhythmic cawing of a distant raven, a terrible, weighty silence hung in the air for a moment or two as we tried to compute what we were seeing.
This can't be real,
Morgan blurted out, his lip trembling, his face pale and clammy. That thing, Noah hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. That thing I saw in the trees. We turned to him, bodies stilled by terror, eyes wide with electric fear. This is its nest. A thundering noise echoed through the trees around us, something that broke the ominous stillness of the death-saturated clearing. A deep, otherworldly howl, unlike anything I had heard before or since, assaulted our ears. I felt nauseous with fear, like I might regurgitate my measly breakfast all over the forest floor. As the roar died down, that horrible silence returned once again. We could hear the rustling of pines, the crunching of dry twigs and pine needles in the near distance. Something was coming for us.
Run!
Morgan didn't scream or shout. His command was hushed, dampened by the raw, blinding terror that coursed through us. So we ran. We ran blindly through the pines as stray branches and bramble thorns scratched and sliced every exposed flesh. Exhaustion didn't seem to be a factor anymore. Neither was the weight of our backpacks. We tore through the forest at breakneck speeds, fear and adrenaline providing strength and stamina that seemed almost impossible. Noah ran ahead of me, instinctually looking back over his shoulder for a second to see if the thing had gained on us. I'll never forget the horror and dread in his eyes. It was the same thing that he'd saw through the binoculars. The thing that we told him wasn't real was crashing through the forest towards us, and it was angry. He yelped like a terrified dog, somehow managing to increase the speed of his run as he heard the same eldritch howl cut through the trees. It was close now. Really close.
This way!
Morgan cried, darting off to one side. He too had seen something. But it was not the thing that pursued us. We followed, beginning to notice the familiar straight lines of man-made structure hurtling towards us. We squeezed through a narrow gap in the rusted chain-link fence and sprinted towards the nearest building. It was coated in ivy and other creeping vines, so completely that the entire construction appeared to be nothing more than a mass of vegetation. Noah and Morgan occupied themselves with trying to wrench open the heavy steel door, but my attention was drawn to a painted sign that was attached to the concrete wall close by. It too was partially concealed by wild greenery, but as I tore the vines away, more and more of the lettering became legible. Minister of Defense, it read, Gallows Forest Research and Development Center. Authorized personnel only. "Freaking help us!" Noah cried, his voice breaking from all the consuming terror that gripped him. I barely had time to process what I had read before I was helping loosen the rusted iron door handle. One more pair of hands was all it needed. It groaned as we dragged it open, revealing a dark, cavernous space within. We had no choice. We were to enter the pitch-black room, or suffer the same fate as the millennia-old corpses we had just fled. We would be torn apart and our bodies would be taken as morbid trophies. Just as whatever was hunting us was about to burst through the tree line, we slammed the iron door closed, sealing ourselves inside the decrepit abandoned building. We thought we had escaped our grisly fate. We thought we were safe inside such a heavy steel and thick concrete. But we couldn't have been more wrong. The horror had only just begun.